Thank you for attending our second Race and Dialogue event. Today's conversation features Peter Erickson and Brandy Williams. And before we begin the program, I wish to tell you a little bit about the Newberry and present the Newberry's land acknowledgement. The Newberry is an independent research library in Chicago with collections spanning more than 6 centuries of human history in Europe and the Americas. We've been free and open to the public since 1887, and we will be reopening our doors next week on March 2nd to readers and visitors. The Center for Renaissance Studies promotes the use of Newberry collections by graduate students and postgraduate scholars in the fields of late medieval, Renaissance, and early modern studies. As part of our commitment to addressing the ongoing legacies of dispossession and settler colonialism, as well as our relationship with the city, the land, and the environment, the Newberry Library has written the following land acknowledgement in partnership with the Chicago American Indian Center. Located near the confluence of several waterways, the Newberry Library sits on land that intersects with the Aboriginal homelands of several tribal nations, the Council of the Three Fires, the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe nations, the Illinois Confederacy, the Peoria and Kaskaskia nations, and the Maiamia, Weya, Thakiwaki, and Meskwaki nations. The Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Kickapoo, and Mascoutin nations also call the region of Northeast Illinois home. Indigenous people continue to live in this area and celebrate their traditional teachings and life ways. Today, Chicago is home to one of the largest urban Indigenous communities in the United States, and this land remains an important place for Indigenous peoples. As a Chicago institution, it is the Newberry's responsibility to acknowledge this historical context and build reciprocal relationships with the tribal nations on whose lands we are situated. Now I'm delighted to introduce you to Brandy C. Williams, who will join Peter Erickson in conversation in today's program. And I'd like to invite Brandy and Peter to turn their videos on. Brandy is a joint PhD student in English and Theater and Performance Studies at the University of Chicago. Her work in Premodern critical race studies deploys Black feminist frameworks to examine categories of social formation in early modern drama in the framework of intersectionality. And previously, Brandy has delivered guest lectures at University of Maryland and Amherst College, and has presented work on mutually constructive social formation along the axis of race and gender in Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus, as well as aimless intellectual pursuit as a colonial project. Brandy's first publication, a double performance review of Harlem Shakespeare Festival's all-female Othello and of Becoming Othello, a Black Girl's Journey, is forthcoming in Shakespeare Bulletin. So I'll turn it over to Brandy. I also wanted to note that you can put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And towards the end of the program, we will turn to those questions, and Brandy will have some time to ask some of them. So I want to thank you again for being here and look forward to this wonderful conversation. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Brandy.
Thanks, Leah, for the lovely introduction. And thank you to everyone at the Newberry, particularly in the Center for Renaissance Studies, who's helped put together this session today and the whole series. Couldn't have made it happen without y'all. And so before I introduce Peter, I've got just a couple of housekeeping notes for the session today. So for our live tweeters, we're using the hashtag CRS Race and Dialogue today, so you can track the conversation there. Today's discussion is also being recorded and will be shared on the Center for Renaissance Studies YouTube page. And again, as Leah has flagged for us, if you have any questions, just drop them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them at the end of the session. And that Q&A box, if you're not familiar with, is on that bottom Zoom window menu. And that being said, I want to introduce Peter Erickson. Peter Erickson is the gold standard for allyship in pre-modern critical race studies. Peter's held a variety of appointments in teaching positions and librarianship at various institutions, including Northwestern University, Clark University, Clark Art Institute, Wesleyan University, and Williams College. Throughout his expansive career, Peter has written and spoken extensively about race, including whiteness, from Shakespearean drama to feminist poetry like Adrienne Rich, Rita Dove, and June Jordan, to contemporary Black art and artists such as Carrie James Marshall, Glenn Ligon, and Fred Wilson. He's the author of several books, including Patriarchal Structures in Shakespeare's Drama, Rewriting Shakespeare, Rewriting Ourselves, and Citing Shakespeare, the Reinterpretation of Race in Contemporary Literature and Art. Some of his additional publications include the co-authored essay, A New Scholarly Song, Rereading Early Modern Race, which is the introduction to the 2016 special issue of Shakespeare Quarterly, co-edited with Kim Hall, which focuses on critical race studies in the early modern period. And Peter also has various essays published in Inca, the Journal of Contemporary African Art. So over the last few months, I've had the honor and privilege of coming to know Peter. And since that isn't a particularly long time, I want to take a page out of Noemi's book from last session and share some messages from people who've known Peter far longer and far better than I have. Peter's friends and colleagues have called him, quote, a friend and mentor of zero pretensions with a great sense of humor and just so incredibly delightful to be around. An astute analyst, Peter has also been called an intellectual giant who set the pace for a field that didn't want to hear what he had to say, that couldn't accept his insistence that our work should be shaped by the need for a just world. They've also noted that Peter is a rare gem who always carries the right mix of humility, passion, and dedication to serving the causes of the underrepresented, unacknowledged, unseen, oppressed, and undervalued, someone who sees people and cultures in their fullness, who listens first. Peter stands behind, beside, and beneath, lending a hand and mind to play his part in making a better, less racist world, carrying the light of a better future forward, doing it gently, not needing any fanfare or even acknowledgement. He's always there to help shine a light on new work, to amplify other people's scholarship, and to challenge the old guard to engage with the new, a model of the scholar who continues to learn, to challenge himself, and to expand his horizons. And all of these letters that I've excerpted have I've agreed with every one of them in the short time that I've been able to know Peter. He is truly one of the most humble people, if not the most humble person I've ever met. Someone who truly deserves to have their greatness and their contributions recognized. And I also want to note, especially for the other grad students and other early career and junior scholars like myself, knowing the work of people like Peter is so, so critical to what we're doing as we come up and as we enter the field. So consider this a small piece of the work that we need to become familiar with and the people we need to become familiar with to make our own work better, and recognize the work that they've put in over the last decades to make sure that we can have a much easier path to do this sort of scholarship and grow our field. And that being said, thank you so much again, Peter, for your time. I'm so glad to have you here with us today, and so glad that we get to spotlight you for this session.
Oh, thank you.
So for the first question, I want to talk first and foremost about your career trajectory. So as you and I have discussed, your trajectory isn't really the kind of clear and linear path that I think a lot of junior scholars like myself might imagine. Your career is a clear example of the idea that the sort of locked in template that so many of us are led to exalt isn't the only way to be an impactful scholar. So for those who are unfamiliar with your career, can you outline what that trajectory was and how you've made these various career transitions and why they've come to mean so much to you?
Yes, well, thank you. When I first got to Amherst College, I had the opportunity to go to Raleigh, North Carolina. The chaplain had opened up this possible trip for us. It was spring vacation, so-called spring vacation. So we went to Raleigh, North Carolina, and went to help with registering for voters of Black people, and we provided handouts to help. This was not an easy process, not a guaranteed success, but to at least support it. And the second time around, 1 year later, was to go to Greenville, Mississippi. And this is the opportunity to see the civil rights movement firsthand in action. And I had then to go back to school, but all of this opened me to that and what was going on, and it became part of my thinking and way of thinking about literature and everything else available to me. And and in Greenville, Mississippi, which I haven't, I was assisting with a census. That's what we were asked to be helped with. And let me just jump. After I graduated from Amherst College, I planned immediately to go to the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies in Birmingham, England. And the reason I went there was I wanted to work with Stuart Hall, who by that time had become famous. And he was Jamaican born, and he was a British cultural theorist. And I knew I could learn from him and work with him. I had found out about him. And so that's where I went. And I was there for only 1 year. And the reason for that is this country was taking on war in Vietnam. And I was opposed to that. And when my draft board called me back to the US, I told them that I was not going to do that. And I applied for conscientious objector status, which they agreed to without much of a discussion. And the alternative service was in 2 years in Haiti at Hôpital Albert Schweitzer in the halfway in the middle of Haiti. And I was there for 2 full years. And I had my job because I was made the manager for the pharmacy, which was vital to the hospital. And I learned something about my being part of white racial minority for a sustained period. And Papa Doc was still in charge at that time, and the Tonton Macoute was active. And so I learned a lot through all of this 2-year period. And from there, after the 2 years, I went directly to UC Santa Cruz, and I could begin my graduate study. And the people that I was working with who were amazing, Harry Berger, C.L. Barber, Norman O. Brown, and Harry Berger was the most incredible, but they were all three wonderful. They were models of wide-ranging scholarship and gave me a lot of freedom. And so I was still, this was my opportunity and start going again about work. And the first academic position after I completed my work was at Williams College, and in the English department when I was teaching first year students, but I was being required to use a syllabus. And when I looked at the syllabus, there were only white authors, and you went down the line, and that was it. And I opposed that immediately. And I had a colleague, Melvin Dixon, who arrived at the same time I did and was in the same problem. And so we started to work with each other. And I started myself working for the first time with Alice Walker and Adrienne Rich. I brought these into class, and the students were very excited about this, which was representing a change, which was going to be continuing. And the students were very excited about that because they knew our culture was changing, and I wanted to be part of that. And I shared with that immediately, and I just kept going, not only reading, but also meeting and writing and publishing. And that's because I wanted to be part of the change taking place. And it just went from there for me to keep moving forward and keep making contributions as far as I can. So, and my first work had to do with, my first book had to do with, concerned with Shakespeare. It had to do, however, all with focusing on women and not just male characters. And so that would be a very quick summary of the expansion of my trying to work in different areas and not be confined to one. And as I said, I was completely opposed to reading all white males for an English department. That I was completely opposed to.
You know, on the note of the sort of like especially you mentioned with the work that you did at UC Santa Cruz, particularly the work you did with Harry Berger, this idea of wide-reaching scholarship or wide-ranging scholarship has become really central. Like that's really the biggest pattern, I think, in your work is that, you know, no matter what, you're always moving beyond the canon and moving beyond, you know, the sort of like kind of like basic or like baseline assumptions that I think a lot of us are taught to kind of pursue as we sort of like intellectualize and then we think about all of these different works and the sort of histories behind their study. But I want to pivot a little bit. So your later work gets into visual art, and that's really where you've been like carving out a home in those more recent publications. So what made you kind of make that transition from doing so much work with Shakespeare and with literature broadly to kind of focusing more on the world of visual art? And how has that been, like, what are the opportunities that you found in this sort of like interdisciplinary approach?
Well, I can say it in one term. Fred Wilson the Black artist, and he was chosen to represent the United States at the Venice Biennale in 2003. And that's how I came to be aware of his work. And one of the things that's really interesting or caught my attention is that his exhibition at the Venice Biennale is that it was combining the language of Shakespeare's Othello. That was a very prominent part of his exhibition. But in addition to that, exhibition contained Wilson's own visual creations. And so it created a very clear exhibition between language, the verbal part, and at the same time, the visual creations. And it was a question of how do you put those two things together? And that's what drew me in to this. And the greater complexity for analysis involved the issue of race. And it was another way to approach something instead of, it was a new and another method of analyzing. And this was a very complex intersection, and but it was very exciting because it opened things way about, and that was a very exciting thing for me. And that was what got me involved in visual art instead of being confined to only Shakespeare, but for looking at race. But there were other things that would allow me to expand my approach to my commitment to this. And I started writing about visual art, contemporary, African-American contemporary artists. And I found that that was extending my interest in race by having another medium, not just one or not just one area, but a wide ranging. And so I would just go back and forth and open up all the doors that I possibly could. And fortunately, I had something to say. I didn't have a huge background, but I developed one quickly, and I was able to publish these things. And I'll just mention as one example, Kerry James Marshall, right here in Chicago, had extraordinary work, and I like putting energy into that, as well as to, not that I had given up on literature. I wanted it to be, this is what I mean by wide ranging, not being confined to just one mode of work, but to have literature and art and combining them.
And I think that's something that I also want to kind of highlight within that is that, you know, another sort of recurrent theme in your work, you know, no matter what field or object of study that you've been examining, you've always attended to race in very critically informed ways, and not the sort of like, oh, we're just gonna like talk about Othello we know he's Black, and like leave it there. You always take things further. And some of the most extraordinary work of yours, I think, has been in the way that you attend to whiteness as well as a racial category, as a charged racial category, and not just a sort of neutral one. So there's actually, I want to pull a quote, or turn to a quote rather, that I've pulled from your essay, Profiles in Whiteness, from Stanford Humanities Review, published in 1993. So you can get a sense for our attendees for how long this frame of thinking has been in Peter's mind, and how he's been an early pioneer of thinking about critical whiteness in terms of race. So you write, Peter, even though art cannot be transformed into a political arena in which ethnicity operates in the same way as in politics, ethnicity nevertheless has a bearing on art. The ideology of universalism prevents us from exploring how. It begs too many questions by ignoring them, and hence leaves out important elements of our actual experience of art. And I think this quote is really it really stands out to me, especially thinking about your work in Shakespeare studies too, but also, of course, as mentioned in the quote, your work in contemporary visual art, especially as you're drawing the two together. And so I'm thinking about some of the moments that we've discussed, you know, your work with June Jordan and Alice Walker and Adrienne Rich and Rita Dove, your work with Black visual artists like Fred Wilson, Glenn Ligon, your publications in the Inca Journal of Contemporary African Art. I'm thinking about all of this just because the way that you turn the focus from just like race kind of as like a blanket sort of thing to actually thinking about your own positionality as a white male critic is really interesting, and really, I think, incredibly fruitful as we sort of like think through these things. And so I'm wondering, you know, following your work in that line, why has it been so important for you to turn to your own positionality as a white male critic?
Well, that's a good question and a complicated one. And the one thing I would add is that there's a new book coming out, as you've probably been aware of, and it's called White People in Shakespeare, and that will be coming out with a lot of interesting essays. The one thing that I would want to add to make this a little bit more interesting and complicated, which is that the white identity has two separate locations. One is inside the play is a white character, but there's another way of that need be discussed is the reader of the white reader of the play, and so there's a little bit of tension and interaction between the white character and the white reader. They are two different white formations, and I think we need to be able to address both of those elements. And so the just apart from talking about characters, which of course that's what we do, and very important, but at the same time we have to stand back and say, Shakespeare doesn't give us a white identity, and we white people, have to develop that and discuss that, speak about it, and to take it further.
That's fantastic. I'm also wondering, and don't feel like you have to take this on right now, because I know these are, like you pointed out, these are really complicated sort of ideas. But I'm wondering how that gets complicated too, by thinking about the whiteness of Shakespeare himself as like a sort of like third axis, so like you've pointed out, the white character, the white reader, but also the white writer. And so thinking about the sort of dynamics between the three of those, I think is really interesting here. And so you've already mentioned your contribution to the White People in Shakespeare collection that I believe is being edited by Arthur Little. But can you tell us a little bit about some of your latest projects? What's up on the horizon?
Oh, okay. Well, one thing is called Shakespeare and Social Justice. Again, it was a collection of essays. The editor is David Ryder. And I think that to put social justice as the title of such a book is an announcement to say, this is how we are we are approaching this as the central issue here. And it's a different way of approaching Shakespeare. And it's to use as our present situation, to make use of it in a different way that places the emphasis on social justice. That's what we're here for. And I'm not speaking just for myself, I'm speaking about all of the people who were involved in this book, Shakespeare and Social Justice. This is a new way of stating very clearly what the purpose is. So that's one thing I would add here. And but I think and White People in Shakespeare is addressing another issue, and bring it by putting that on the title. It's a way of saying that this must be addressed so that a full understanding of race, including racial whiteness, has to be addressed. And so I think these represent changes that are at this point in time, and are new issues that will keep us exploring and going forward, and talking about finding other ways to expand the work on race, on race. Sorry, and so it's opening up a new emphasis.
So on that note, Peter, I want to go ahead and turn, you've given us so much to think about. I want to turn to an audience question that we've got. So this one is from Noemi in DIA, and Noemi writes, "Thank you so much for this interview and for everything you've done for the field, Peter. What advice would you give to white scholars who want to be allies and accomplices, as the title of our session gestures toward, in early modern critical race studies today, and what are the traps to avoid?
Well, I think that's a good direction to be going on. And for each person, you have to find a way. And that's an easy thing for me to say. But I think if I may talk about Kim Hall, whom we all know, and there is a lot of work to use as a basis, and it just takes time to, I don't need to tell you this, that you can just move forward, and there's a lot of material, as you know, to work with, to start with, and then start building, not just adding, but building collaborations that would extend what is already started, and that we, for example, the special issue of Shakespeare Quarter is a way of saying this has happened, this is acceptable, this is now a starting point, is a kind of a base. This is now accepted as a value issue, a value area that needs to be taken even further than it already has, and it's been established. And I think this is what you will be doing. So and I think that we need to have new people to work with, and to you, I'm sure, will be part of a group already, and sharing, not being just isolated or alone. You will have colleagues to be with, and to work with, and to share with, and to move forward. And that's been vital for me. I've been very glad to early on to meet people, and people I could work with, and know that I could be sharing and going back and forth, and be accepted, and working together, and just keep pushing forward.
So Peter, you mentioned collaboration, and so I was wondering if I can ask you to talk a little bit about your relationship with Kim Hall, who I think is one of the most well-known collaborators, especially thinking about that special issue. So can you tell us more about how you met and how you started to work together, and what your collaboration has looked like over the years in various projects?
Well, let me just give you a little story here, because I had been asked to review proposed books, and I could never find anything that seemed interesting and new. And then out of all of a sudden, Kim's book um, uh, was given to me as something that I should uh, um, look at for the publisher. And I immediately, once reading it, thought, this is going to change things. This is amazing. And I am committed to this. And I just said very positive things about this should be published right away, because it's going to be a huge contribution. And so that was one example where it all of a sudden was there, and and not only to me, but for everybody to change things around and to open different ways of going ahead. This was a breakthrough moment, and you, as you go forward, you will have experiences like that, and you already have significant friends, and there will be more, and things will keep going forward, and sharing is part of that, and knowing that you're not alone, but you can work with a group and you can share with a group, and that gives support, which we all need. And so this is, and I have to say, well, this is sort of an example. The Shakespeare Quarterly example was just a kind of a landmark that said this is established and this is just going forward, and it can't be stopped. It's just going to go forward. And I always felt that this kept me going, because things were really being wide open, or open more widely, and are going to just keep growing and keep being established, and there's no turning back. And that was once I started going to conferences, it became, I wasn't going by myself. I was going to meet a group, and this group was working together and sharing together. And it was, and the wider that can be, the better it is, in my view, because you hear more ideas, different ideas, and can put them together in your way of thinking, other might be thinking, and it has the possibility of going further, and you can be part of that.
So I have another question from an attendee. This one is from Blakely Mitchell, who writes, going off of your experience in the classroom, are there any specific strategies or tips you have for white teachers teaching these books by Black authors within the classroom at different education levels, specifically to engage conversations about race in a progressive way?
Mm-hmm. Well, if you have things to say, then they can be presented and make sense, and you have to be sensitive. I'm not. I can, as a teacher, I had things to say, things to point out, but I wasn't saying that I had full control of everything that's occurring and things, everything that's being said. But I think getting everybody involved and getting into it, then I think it's, I would say that I'm teaching and speaking about issues, but not to say that I know everything and I am in complete control, and um, uh, and raising 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 questions and asking people to write papers is very important, because then that is the opportunity for the student to make statements and perspectives and so on. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't think that I would be excluded from classrooms that involve issues about race, and I want to be able to provide information, help that and ideas that I have to share without claiming that they are the answer.
I really love that. It also makes me sort of think about my own teaching. And, you know, admittedly, I am not a white teacher. I'm a Black and Lao teacher, but I find it really helpful when I'm in the classroom to like be really transparent about my positionality and my relationship to whatever I'm teaching, to kind of highlight for the students, you know, how am I coming to this the way that I'm coming to this? You know, how have I encountered this text? Like, I always love to tell the fun story of, you know, like my first reading of Othello, which for those who may not have heard this story before, came by way of a sexy vampire novel, not Twilight, to add. But, you know, I think thinking about the ways that we as educators come to these texts and sharing that with our students becomes a really useful tool, just because it opens up the space of like, oh, okay, so maybe you don't necessarily have to encounter this in like a really specific, like sort of like elite environment, you know, like you can stumble upon it in, you know, some of the most like seemingly random ways. And I think creating that space is really useful for students. So we've got a couple more questions, if we can squeeze these in. So this one is from Ryan Campania, who writes, "You've spoken about the importance of collaboration, namely with people of color, which is very important. But I wondered too, as a young white male scholar, what do you recommend I do to push my peers and the folks who look like me to also support the work of pre-modern critical race studies and encourage them to expand the field, even if it may not be the sole object of their research, but only one tangent?"
Yeah, makes sense to me. I think, yeah.
Like how, I guess, like how can folks like Ryan, you know, like, I guess, like, how can folks like Ryan, like, push other white folks in the field to expand their thinking in these sorts of ways? Like, beyond just, like, teaching the work and thinking with the work.
Well, I think if we're talking about students, the range is there. and what is available to students is for them to engage with, and that's what we're doing in the classroom, is to have an exchange, to have a discussion, and
and just get like those ideas circulating. So for our last question, since we're coming up against time, and I'll offer some thoughts on this too. But Peter, what are you most excited to see in the future of pre-modern critical race studies? What excites you about where the field might go, and what's really exciting to you right now?
Oh, well, I have to tell you that it's still visual art, and I'm seeing more opportunities that I have, and I want to bring that into the literary field to use, and to have ways to think about. I will be having some time with Fred Wilson, and I will be having an interview with him, and there's going to be an Oxford handbook on Shakespeare and race, edited by Patricia Ekheimi, and that is something new for me to be able to interview. And Fred is very much steeped in Shakespeare, but is also doing other things. And anyway, this is one of the ways in which I keep going and have some new ways of proceeding. And so what the outcome of this will be is yet to be seen, but that's the kind of thing that I'm going to be doing to kind of open up something a little bit new. And how's that going to be expressed, and how can it be helpful, and how can this be useful? And but I'm just talking about myself, but talking about younger people, I am really excited about young scholars, and of young scholars of color, and taking over and adding, and after a certain, I'm excited about that, even if I'm aging out. But this is a really hopeful ongoing growth, and it's going to make things happen, continue making happen. And I think that's great. And it's going to include new things, additions, things that needed to be added on. And as I say, I'm aging out. So I'm very glad to see that, and to have that happen and go forward. And continue to make changes and continue to go forward and grow.
Yeah, I'm also
And you will
really
be one of them.
excited. I will. I'm trying. I'm working hard.
Yeah, I
I
know
promise.
I know you are, and you already know a lot. So that's it.
Yeah, I'm also really excited to see so many grad students, especially and undergrads too, because it's like wild to me that like so many of these ideas I didn't come into contact with until I got to grad school. And so to see, you know, these lines of thought happening and being expanded at the undergraduate level is really exciting. And I'm really excited to see that happen, you know, K through 12 to, you know, like what happens when we think more deeply about Othello, although arguably, I don't know that reading Othello in high school is maybe the best. I guess it depends who's teaching it and how they're teaching it. But I think thinking about, you know, what's coming up is, you know, the most exciting. And like you pointed to, just like the new objects that people are bringing in, I think is also really exciting. Like I've seen some people who are like doing stuff with like dance and engaging other fields that are focused in different sort of media and different, like we're moving beyond just like the printed page, so to speak, which I think is really, really exciting. But I do also want to caution the junior scholars that, you know, in all of this excitement as we're moving forward, I think the most important thing is to really make sure that we never let go of the critical histories and the sort of like intellectual ancestry of the field. Because I think when we lose sight of those, we kind of forget, and then we, you know, we reinvent the broken wheel of like very generic, basic Shakespeare studies. And I just find that really tiresome. So on that note, thank you so much, Peter. It's been such a blast, and I know we'll stay in touch.
Yes. But
But
things will continue to change. That's
absolutely.
what we're doing. And I know you will do.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter and Brandy, for this wonderful conversation. We're so happy to have documented this and to especially documented Peter's career and his contributions, because as we've been sort of joking, he's been a man of mystery. So we're happy to learn so much more about him. And thank you to Brandy for guiding us through this lovely conversation. And thanks for all of you for joining us today. And a recording of this session will be available on our YouTube page. And I also want to take a moment to plug our next session and remind you too that Kim Hall's conversation with Noemi is available on YouTube now. So feel free to check it out if you missed our session back in November. And please come back on April 13th to hear a conversation between Scott Manning Stevens and Blair Topish Caldwell about Indigenous studies in the archives. And we're hoping that these conversations will continue over the next years in our center as we plan an exhibition devoted to race in the pre-modern world in conjunction with the Race Before Race conference at the University of Chicago in 2023. And we want to thank Lisa Freeman and Noemi Nadiai for helping us to organize this series. And we're especially grateful to Noemi for acting as co-curator of our exhibition and as a consultant in the center. So everybody stay well. Thank you again for being here today. And please keep in touch, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Stay
Peter.
safe,
Thank you,
everyone.
Brandy. This was wonderful.
Thank you.